Hi, everybody. Welcome to Lecture 16 in our series on the Trivium. That is the first three of the classical liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Today we begin our discussion of the logic of arguments, which will be the last portion of the course, and will introduce the distinction between deductive logic and inductive logic. We'll come back to the idea of inductive logic later in the course in one of the last lectures when we look at some specific kinds of inductive arguments. Today we're just talking about the distinction in this short lecture. On our title slide here, we have a useful chart that I did not produce, and I am grateful to the producers of this chart, illustrating the distinction between deductive and inductive logic. The one thing that I will highlight here just on the title slide is something that will be the distinguishing characteristic between these two. Deductive logic gives us a conclusion that follows with certainty from the premises. It absolutely must be true. It has nothing to do with perspective or opinion. Inductive logic will give us a conclusion that does not follow necessarily with certainty, but follows with a certain probability. And it is here that we need to consider all of those dimensions of modern thinking, such as one's perspective, one's biases, and other things that might be playing a role in our reasoning, even if we're not aware of it. These are two kinds of reasoning. And so we can ask our question, what is reasoning? In reasoning, Hauser gives us this: our mind moves from one point to another in order to get to yet a third point. Hauser, I believe, here is thinking about the structure of what we will call a syllogism. And we'll introduce this in just a moment. This will be our basic structure of logical argument in what remains of this course. The goal is to discover a truth that we did not know before. So if I know that one thing is true, and I know that another thing is true, or let's just say if I hold that one thing is true and I hold that another is true, what follows logically, parentheses, with certainty, from the relationship between those two? What can I conclude, right? In the case of, well, let's just lay out our types of reasoning here and then I'll comment on them. Our first type of reasoning is induction. This is based on observation. Hauser writes this: we use this to develop universal concepts like man, meaning human being, by abstracting or drawing out the universal man or universal idea of the human being from our experience of particular human beings, right? So in this case, I am taking in a bunch of what other philosophers maybe have called sense data. I have certain experiences of the world. This may or may not be reliable. I may or may not be clear in my thinking and perception and whatnot, but I am drawing certain conclusions from that. And we might even say those are provisional conclusions. If I encounter new evidence, I might need to revise those conclusions. Deduction, by contrast, is not based on observation. In fact, it has nothing to do with observation. It only is based on logic and the rules of logical inference. This draws a conclusion by means of a middle term or a series of middle terms. And we'll introduce, well, I think we can do that now, what a middle term means. So, we'll come to that in a moment. Back to our chart. Deductive logic and inductive logic. Very helpful image, and thanks again to the producer of the image. In the case of deductive logic, I'm moving from a premise to a premise to a premise, something like given that, given that, given that, therefore the conclusion, right? And as we've emphasized already, that conclusion will follow with certainty from the premises. If the premises are true, then the conclusion I can know with certainty will be true. Induction, however, is probabilistic, right? It is a more, quote, risky inference, as the creator of this image puts it. For example, I might move from the observation that 90% of humans are right-handed, and the observation that John, in this case, is a human being, is human, and conclude that it is, say, 90% probable that John is right-handed, right? So that doesn't give me certainty, but it gives me something to start from. Let's take a look, though, at the syllogism, because the syllogism is what we're doing. We're going to be focusing in the coming lectures on deductive logic. And deductive logic traditionally has been based on this, and we've seen this example already many times in the series. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Let's identify what each of these lines is. So we start with what is called the major premise. And this is bringing together two universal concepts. And we determine this, or each developed by inductive generalization. So what he means here, Hauser is using this term, inductive generalization. I've experienced a bunch of human beings in my life. And so I've formed a concept, human being, and I'm using that as a term. I have a universal idea of what a human being is. Again, subject to revision, but I'm basing my claim on my current understanding of that. I have an understanding of what mortality means. I have seen things die. I have known people, perhaps, who have died, and I have a general notion of what that is. And I'm taking that as another term here. So I have the term men, and I have the term mortal. The second premise in a syllogism is called the minor premise. And this is joining an individual concept with, joining an individual, I should say, with a universal concept. So here, the term man is continued from the major premise. It appears also in the minor. And I'm introducing here an individual, Socrates, right? And that's an individual about whom I would like to know something. I'd like to get new knowledge about this individual. And that new knowledge comes in the conclusion. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. In subsequent lectures, we're going to be looking at exactly how this is put together and how it works. The thing I want to emphasize here is very simple. A syllogism is not basing itself on observation. Each of the premises, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, those are being based on observation, on what Hauser calls inductive generalization, right? I'm looking at my experience of the world, I am forming certain concepts, and then in the argument itself, I am drawing out the logical conclusion of those concepts. So primarily what we're going to be doing in the logic of arguments is looking at those laws of logic, rules of reasoning, deductive reasoning. We're not going to be focusing on how we initially form those claims that are functioning here as premises. For example, all men are mortal. Just one slide here to conclude from Hauser, and we'll wrap up these remarks. He writes the following. We need both deductive and inductive reasoning. By focusing on deductive reasoning here, we're not saying that inductive reasoning is not important. We're just saying that this course is focusing on deductive reasoning. The most important difference between these two types of reasoning is that deductive reasoning proceeds by means of a universal middle term, but inductive reasoning does not. In inductive reasoning, there is no middle term. Our mind proceeds directly from examples of a universal conclusion to that conclusion. These two kinds of reasoning complement each other. So again, as in the case of forming an idea of what is a human being. Well, I meet this human being, that human being. I am able to identify them as human beings. Take another example, a tree. Right? I see 10 different kinds of trees. They look very different, but I've formed in my mind something associated with the word tree. Right? And I formed a concept of tree, an idea of a tree, and I might ask myself, does this new thing that I've encountered, maybe a bush, fit the definition of tree, or is it something else? Right? And this is what scientists and taxonomists are always doing when new species are discovered. All right, friends, deduction, induction. Our focus primarily is going to be deduction, but remember, induction is just as important in forming the propositions that we're using as the basis of our deductive arguments.